Well, good morning. I'd like to continue our precedent of starting on time. I'd like to welcome you to what is already the 31st annual meeting of DDP. Some of you were here yesterday for a most extraordinary course offered by Stephen Hatfill, and I hope we will have a repeat performance next year. All of us may be first responders these days, and those who were there, I think, have a good chance of being able to save a life by some remarkably obvious but until recently unknown methods. I seem to need to come here once a year, and on Independence Day, which just passed, I like to watch 1776. And maybe some of you here share my reaction to that movie. I have to identify with John Adams as he's portrayed there, and they all start out with the song, "Sit down, John," and will someone shut that man up? And then toward the end, he commiserates with George Washington, who keeps sending these desperate communications to the Congress, and Continental Congress seems to ignore them. Is anybody there? Does anybody care? Does anybody see what I see? Now, some of you, I think, do see what's going on, but for all our efforts, we haven't been able to get very many other people to see the need for homeland defense. There was a brief revival in this in the 1980s. Some of us even went to the National Emergency Training Center in Emmitsburg, Maryland, and talked about civil defense. Under Ronald Reagan, General Julius Becton tried to turn FEMA into a truly all hazards instead of all hazards but one preparedness, and we talked about nuclear weapons and terrorism. I didn't see too much of that back then. Back in those days, FEMA actually sent representatives to give talks at our meeting. But the Office of Civil Defense is long gone. I think it was closed by the first President Bush. And now FEMA seems to be nothing but a money truck and a photo op for various politicians who show up at disaster scenes. In 9/11, of which I'll be speaking later, we had a brief awakening, or so it appeared. But we quickly went back to sleep. Now here we are in Houston, and I think most of you are probably as old, almost as old as I am, and you know what the phrase meant. Houston, we have a problem. Because back in those days, Houston was mission control. We will have an astronaut speaking at our banquet, thanks to Howard Hayden, who arranged that for us, and a tour of the Ad Astra rocket factory. But the mission of going to Mars seems to be a private enterprise mission these days. NASA, we learned when we went to Cape Canaveral at our Orlando meeting, which was really a very heartbreaking experience to see the past glories of our space program. Back when NASA was engaged in this magnificent, ambitious, but still humanly possible mission of exploring the moon and Mars. Now, NASA has a more godlike mission. They're going to control the Earth's thermostat. And they're going to keep the sea level from rising. NASA GISS, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, until recently headed by James Hansen, was the one man in the whole world who had the authority to determine what the world's annual average temperature was, and I think to the nearest tenth of a degree. But now he has gone on to what we used to call agitprop, but I think now he actually promotes civil disobedience. And GISS has the broad mission now of studying global change. Let's see, I have a few slides here. There is some CME being offered by the Association of American Physicians and Surgeons, non-AMA approved, but still may help with your licensure. There's more about that in your packets. But I'm going to talk mainly about what did happen on 9/11, which began to bring about some global change. Our lives are really different now after than they were before. And a lot of people are interested in what really did happen there. So of course we had a blue ribbon commission. This is how we determine truth here in the United States. We get all the world's best experts, or at least in the United States, and they ponder and reflect and gather all the evidence and come up with the authoritative opinion on what happened, just like the Warren Commission, which we'll learn about at lunch, and nobody believes what the Warren Commission came up with. I do know of one blue ribbon commission that got at the truth, the one about the Challenger disaster. And that was because Richard Feynman, one of our most brilliant physicists, who also had some street smarts, behaved in a way that commissioners are not supposed to behave in. That he actually did an independent investigation, figured it out, and presented the evidence before a national television audience so 1 million people could see what happened to the O-rings when you put them in cold water, before the commission could study it, reflect on it, file it, bury it, obscure it, and do whatever else the commission does. Maybe this had something to do with 9/11 too, because as you know, asbestos was banned. Andrew Schlafly gave a talk at this meeting about maybe the reason one building stood longer than the other one is because the asbestos insulation on the steel beams went up higher in the building before it was banned, and so they didn't melt. But there are still many people who are speculating about exactly how all the buildings, especially the WT Center number 7, fell down, why, who done it, who knew what when, and why didn't you see it coming? It should have been obvious, and why didn't you do something about it, and all of that. And I think the answers to these questions we probably will never know. For one thing, all the evidence was very efficiently by our government cleaned up, carried away, sent to China. If you had done that at a crime scene, of course, you would be guilty of the crime of tampering with the evidence and obstructing justice. But anyway, that's where it went. So I'm going to stay away from speculation on what really happened there and talk about some things that are obvious and true and I think verified and uncontrovertible. And one is the observation that the Colossus can fall. And it can fall with astonishing speed, maybe at the acceleration due to gravity. And this won't be the first instance of it. We have seen other colossi fall, including the economy of Argentina, which was once one of the richest nations in the world and has never recovered from the fall. Rome fell, the Assyrian Empire fell, and even the Soviet Empire fell. So these things can happen. Then there are some very small things about 9/11 that I think are simply true. And they reminded someone of a very obscure passage in the Bible, which I had never heard quoted before. If I read it, I passed over and it didn't make any impression on me. But Jonathan Cahn, a rabbi, has written a book called The Harbinger, which became an unexpected bestseller. If you have bought an Amazon Kindle that I finally resorted to doing, you could read it tonight. And he quotes Isaiah 9:10. The bricks have fallen, but we will rebuild with hewn stones. The sycamores have been cut down, but we will plant cedars in their place. And this came after Isaiah 9:9 about how the people saying with pride and arrogance in their hearts, a disaster has befallen us. We're not going to try to figure out what we did wrong, think about maybe we took the wrong path and somebody's trying to tell us something. No, we're going to rebuild the same way we're doing it before, but just grander, stronger than before. And what had happened was that Israel had been invaded by the Assyrians, who did a lot of damage. But for some reason they withdrew, at least temporarily, and they did repairs, and things went back to what we now call a new normal. Well, what was going on in Israel? Ancient Israel had forgotten the basis for its exceptionalism. It had lost its moral compass. It was engaged in killing its prophets. It was worshiping idols. It is sacrificing thousands of babies to Baal and Moloch. But there are a few sort of striking coincidences that Cahn points out in his book, The Harbinger. That Assyria, it just happens to be the inventor of terror. They brought terror to the state of being an applied science. And all the nations of the world at that time were very terrified of them. Interestingly, the language they spoke, long extinct Akkadian, is sort of the precursor for Arabic. So in ancient Israel, we had a breach, then we had the terror by the people who maybe spoke the language, and now the land that they occupy, including the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh, is Iraq. Well, there was a sycamore tree at World Trade Center. It wasn't on television, you don't see it burning down, but it was in fact uprooted. And that is verified. There's even a memorial to it that shows the roots of the sycamore tree, at least the American version, botanical version of the tree that grew in ancient Israel, even has a brick entwined in its roots. It was uprooted by the debris from the World Trade Center and probably protected one building on the site that did not fall down, and that was St. Paul's Chapel, which is, by the way, where Washington and our founding fathers went for prayer after he was installed. He was inaugurated as first president in the Capitol, which of course at that time was not Washington, D.C., because it didn't exist, but was New York City. The New York Stock Exchange, symbolized by a sycamore tree also. That the New York Stock Exchange came from the Buttonwood Agreement because these people used to meet under a buttonwood tree, which is a sycamore tree. And then after 9/11, and the sycamore tree was uprooted a couple years later, a crane brought in a tree that was a gift from people, someone, just coincidentally, that was the American botanical equivalent of a cedar tree. And that was planted with great pomp and circumstance in the very hole from which the sycamore tree had been uprooted. Now we know that 9/11 was a World Trade Center. There may be some symbolic significance in that. And there were things set into motion by, I guess, Greenspan then, who's lowered the interest rates, which started inflating the bubble, the housing market, and 7 years later, we had a crash in the financial markets, which is another disaster that we should be very concerned about, and we will talk about a little bit at this meeting. It is said in the Bible that you had to have 2 or 3 witnesses to condemn a person, and maybe to condemn a nation. And we've had some interesting occurrences here. This obscure passage from Isaiah was quoted verbatim just after 9/11 by the Senate Majority Leader, Tom Daschle. And that the ruin was still smoking. And he quoted this to Congress. It was supposed to be a message of hope and inspiration. We will rebuild. And then it was quoted again several years later by John Edwards, who was the Democrat candidate for vice president at the time. And then there's another witness who didn't quote the whole passage, Barack Obama, who did inscribe the words, "We will rebuild," on this steel beam that's now at the top of the Freedom Tower. It's signed by Barack Obama, by Michelle Obama, by Cuomo and Christie and a number of other dignitaries, with the same attitude that we are not going to change our ways whatsoever. We are just going to go on as we were before. Well, did we repair our defenses? Well, not exactly. We did have the Patriot Act, and so now we all live in a panopticon, and we have the Homeland Security and the TSA looking after us, but we did nothing whatsoever for, to defend against the real threats. Even though other nations are getting kind of upset about our panopticon. But they've forgotten about what came before 9/10, which was 9/9, about the pride and arrogance. And then what came after was the destruction of Israel eventually. The Lord shall set up the adversaries of reason, who was the king of Syria, which was a tributary of Assyria, join his enemies together. The Syrians before. Have we heard about Syrians lately? And the Philistines behind. For the people do not seek the Lord of hosts. And the Lord shall cut off the head and tail from Israel, with the head being the elder and honorable, and the tail being prophets who teach lies. For the people, leaders of the people cause them to err, and those who are led by them are destroyed. And then I really got upset about 9:19. Through the wrath of the Lord of hosts is the land darkened. And what do we have happening now? The president destroying our coal industry, which happens to produce 40% of our electricity. Of course, we do not do what the ancient Israelites did. We don't kill our prophets, although we do get them defunded and fired from their jobs. And we do talk about maybe they deserve the death penalty. I don't think it's been meted out just yet, at least not officially. But Peter Beckman warned us about the dangers of the green established church. Are we worshiping idols now? What about the science? This is what we call the sciences, based on consensus, peer-reviewed dogmas, orthodoxy. I talked to a medical student recently. I think he's afraid to talk to me anymore about how he's afraid he could not get an orthopedics residency if he expressed skepticism or denialism about certain things that you have to believe in, such as the human-caused a CO2-induced catastrophe. So we have anathemas today. But we need to remember what the real foundations of science are, that ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. And the method of science is not building models and making up theories, but observation and experiment. Prove all things, hold fast that which is good. I asked a prominent Muslim one time, is there any basis in the Quran about ye shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free? And he couldn't really answer the question. So where are we today? Well, I think we're maybe going along the path to destruction. I hope that at this meeting you will learn something about some real prophets who are trying to tell us the truth about our science and set us back on the right path. So welcome again to our meeting, and I'll turn it over now to our MC, once again, Dr. Arthur Robbins.